So my name's Sherif, and I've been building software for about 25 years. I've been teaching adults for about 20 years. I've worked with about 4,000 adults across a couple of hundred companies, mostly in North America, and about 10 federal agencies, the usual suspects, Homeland Security, Department of Labor, Library of Congress, things like that. And I'm here today to talk to you about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is confusion. And I'm going to try and convince you in the next 10, 15 minutes here that confusion is not the kind of specter of doom that many of us have been trained in school to fear and avoid. But in fact, confusion is the last recognizable milestone before we learn something new. It's a signal, a positive signal for the direction that we want to maintain when we're learning. There are names for this, like deliberate practice. But for the typical student who's stuck in the middle of a lesson where they're feeling a little bit lost, a little bit disconnected, wondering whether or not they belong, reminding them that confusion and that sense of disorientation, disequilibrium, confusion, is actually the thing that they should be chasing. So I'm going to see if I can convince you of that in the next few minutes here. Let me tell you a little bit about NEAR. I work on education at NEAR, and at NEAR, we believe that in a world where people control their assets, their data, and the power of governance in this open web world. And to tie this back to education briefly, if I asked you, do you remember the test that you took sometime in junior high where you were really proud of what you did, the answers that you gave, the score that you got? Who owns that test? Who controls that data? How can you get it back? It's lost in time. And therein, I think, is something interesting that's worth exploring in terms of the future of education and how blockchain can help us, where our learning experience actually become part of the assets and the data that we control as individuals. NEAR protocol is simple, scalable, secure, and sustainable. So from a simplicity perspective, we hear a lot from developers that learning NEAR is really much easier than people expect. So when you talk about learning blockchain, building decentralized applications in a traditional environment, it's very difficult to think about the moving pieces that you have to control. But when you're building on NEAR, it's really like deploying a serverless function to the cloud. So technically speaking, a senior developer with 5-10 years of experience can build a full stack working application on NEAR in maybe half a day or a day. And we've seen that across thousands of developers over several months of work now. Junior developers, let's say those coming out of a coding boot camp or with maybe a year or two of experience, it might take them a week or 2 weeks, depending on the kind of languages that they're familiar with. And with NEAR, you can build smart contracts using Rust and assembly script. And also very recently at Consensus, just a couple of weeks ago, we released our JavaScript SDK. So you can write smart contracts using JavaScript. If you're not a developer and what I'm saying sounds like nonsense, it basically means that of the 30 million or 25 million developers on the planet, let's say half of them are JavaScript developers. All of them can start writing smart contracts today, if they like, on NEAR using JavaScript. That's the exciting bit of news. NEAR, in terms of sustainability, was one of the first blockchains to focus on environmental neutrality. And in the end, what this means is we are very self-conscious about our environmental impact, about our footprint. And in fact, we've gone to great lengths to make sure that we're accountable on those terms. In this one picture are too many pieces to explain, but to the bottom left of the image, I'll call your attention to NEAR protocol, the sort of core of this technology. And around it, several other services. There are many talks that explain these other pieces, but basically Calamaro is about private shards where you can keep data private and yet make attestations about that data to the public using the same security and so on that you get from the general public network. Pagoda, going counterclockwise, is essentially a roll-up of the brain trust behind NEAR protocol, now focused on building developer tools to make working with NEAR even easier. Machina, decentralized storage built on this technology. Aurora, you heard from Alex earlier today, is basically L2 built on Near, so Ethereum L2. And then Octopus is a kind of multi-chain world using IBC, Inter-Blockchain Communications Protocol, the Cosmos technology, I guess, to allow you to build dApp chains. So that's what's happening in the bottom left there. And on the right-hand side, several layers that you may be familiar with as well. This is one way to think about how the Near ecosystem is organized. By the numbers, high TPS, some of the fastest finality in the industry, and it's a sharded blockchain. Thousands of active developers, hundreds of projects and DAOs, accounts, community, weekly active users, and a regional hub strategy with a growing TVL and volume NFTs. I'll leave this slide up here to talk briefly about what some of this means to users. When you talk about, let's say, learning something, you're using a Web 2 application, and you're moving through an experience, taking a course, answering a question, whatever it might be. In the middle of that experience, you don't want to be interrupted. You don't want your flow to be stopped so that you can maybe open up a wallet, sign a transaction, go back into the flow. You want to stay in the flow of the experience. And that's where that 1 second finality and the way that the Near account system handles private keys allows you to sign transactions seamlessly, basically built into the browser. So the user doesn't feel this sense of kind of interruptive experience. So now that I've told you a little bit about Near, I want to see if I can get back to this question of equitable confusion. I think I can tell you a couple of stories, maybe, that would help give you a sense of how this looks. So I can tell you a couple of stories about students that I've worked with that have had trouble typing, students that have had trouble believing that they've learned something, students that are struggling to keep up with the pace of other students around them, students that are maybe hesitating to ask a question in class, and then students who got stuck every time something that looked a little bit mathy came on the screen, and then finally students who didn't believe that they belonged at all in technology. And I'm sharing this list of stories now with you. Maybe you hear yourself in some of these stories. So I think it'd be easier for me to get a sense of how many of you relate to this just by a show of hands. Would you please, thank you for those of you raising your hand already. Would you please raise your hand if you are someone who would consider yourself technical, let's say? You're a developer, project manager, architect, but someone who's technically capable. Anybody? Yeah, maybe about a third of you. Okay, great. And among those who are non-technical, could you please raise your hand if you're a little bit intimidated by the mathy nature of programming, maybe. You're worried about the math. You're worried about the kind of STEM aspect of it. Yeah, it's quite relatable, in fact. I'd like to tell you a story about a student that I had who was absolutely fantastic at working with other people. This was just a couple of years ago before joining Near, where I was working with students of the liberal arts to teach them how to build software, full stack applications using JavaScript in a matter of about 6 weeks. They got 2 college credits at the same time and built their portfolio. One of these students was remarkable in that he asked great questions during the presentation. He would participate very effectively with other people on the team. And you got a sense that he felt like he belonged. He cared about the material. He wanted to learn. But then the minute the problem on the screen had anything that looked mathy, he would freeze. A plus sign, a couple of numbers, something that looked like an equation. And he would practically go mute. He would stop participating. He would stop asking questions. He would get uncomfortable in his seat and disconnect from the project, kind of pushing it away. What was remarkable is that if the problem wasn't mathy, he had no problem at all, not just participating, but also leading the discussion. Again, great ideas, great character, fully engaged. But the minute something mathy came up on screen, he would lock up like this. And you couldn't quite tell what was going on. After a few weeks, we sat and talked about it, he and I together. The room had cleared out. And I asked him, have you noticed this pattern? Whenever something mathy comes up on the screen, you freeze. And he said, yeah, I mean, it hadn't really occurred to me. But maybe it's true, yeah. I said, well, let's try solving some problems together. And we sat and paired for about 5 or 10 minutes. And I put some code on the screen that had nothing to do with math. And he solved the problem quickly and easily. Whatever it was, some sorting problem or something like that. No big deal. And then, as part of the problem, I kind of changed it a little bit to introduce maybe some numbers. Like instead of sorting words, we sorted numbers, something like that. And suddenly he was lost. He couldn't see how it was related. He couldn't think about the algorithm. It didn't make any sense to him how he would solve this problem. And I was a bit sort of disturbed by this. I was like, well, that's fascinating. What is it about the numbers? Is it just numbers? He said, I don't know, but this is really weird. I don't know what's going on. Let me just think. And he was really trying as hard as he could to think through this problem. I said, okay, forget about this one. Let's try something else. What if we talk about maybe concatenating numbers, putting strings, putting things together, a few letters here and there. Okay, no problem. He could do that and kind of solve some interesting problem there. The minute we talked about putting numbers together somehow, whether it was arithmetically or treating them as text or whatever it was, doesn't matter. The minute numbers or anything that looked mathy showed up on the screen, he would lock up again. And so I asked him if he was aware of this experience, because for me it was brutally obvious. And within just a few seconds, we could make him comfortable and we could make him uncomfortable. We could make him effective, we could make him ineffective. And I asked him about his major. He said he really wanted to get into engineering, but he couldn't keep up with the math, and so now he's doing something else, I don't know what. I said, okay, great. How long have you been struggling with this? He said, so many years, so many years. And so this is where I kind of tip my hand and suggest to you that I actually think of myself as a learning therapist. I asked him, tell me about your most vivid memory around this kind of feeling that you're getting around, say, math on the screen in front of you. And he kind of tilted his head down and he smiled for a minute and he said, look, as far back as I can remember, this has been out of my comfort zone. But specifically now, what memory? Well, I do have this one memory, I'm not sure if it's related, where I'm sitting at the kitchen table. I'm 6.5 years old. It's kindergarten, maybe first grade, whatever it is. I've got books sprawled out in front of me. There's a bunch of numbers and math stuff. And my dad is standing next to me, yelling at me. It's breakfast, and I need to solve some pages of math before I go to school. I said, my God, man, that sounds traumatic. What was your dad thinking? No, he was really trying to help me out because, he was struggling with math when he was a kid. He couldn't get into the right career, and he was trying to get out of the town that he was living in, and so his parents didn't really pay attention to this stuff. He's trying to make up for it, I think. I'm not really sure. I should call him and ask him. I said, okay, so does recognizing that experience help you? Let's try the code again. No difference. I said, there's this exercise that I am aware of. It's a kind of a meditation we could do together, where we could spend a little bit of time exploring this feeling that you're having, and maybe that'll help kind of help you work through this. You want to try it? And we went through this exercise together, whatever the details are. It's some breathing and kind of visualization and so on. And about 10 minutes later, he sort of came out of a trance. And he said, yeah, maybe, I don't know if that worked or not, but I don't feel so anxious about this anymore. I said, well, let's go back to that first problem, the mathy one. And so we did, and he solved it. And he was surprised that he solved it. He was actually a little bit disoriented by how quickly he solved it. I said, oh yeah, great, okay, I mean, that makes sense, because it's kind of similar to the one with the words. He said, yeah, exactly. I said, what about the second one? And he solved that. I said, isn't that bizarre? Just having a few minutes of sort of mindful embrace of the confusion of this experience that you had, maybe that's done something for you. The next day I came in to start the class, and he pulled me aside and he said, hey, you wouldn't believe it, but I actually went back last night and this morning, look at this. And he had gone back over the last couple of weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks of material, and solved every single problem that before had completely stumped him. Because he had now somehow relieved himself of this aversion, right? Somehow relieved himself of this sense of doom whenever numbers came up, actually, even though he maybe wasn't so comfortable with them. At least now he was able to welcome that confusion, to embrace that confusion. And I'm sharing this story with you because for me, it's nothing short of miraculous that this individual, maybe 20, 21 years old at the time, who had spent almost his entire academic experience suffering and struggling because of, this aversion to math, whatever that means, could, in a matter of some tens of minutes, change that experience. And maybe for you, the math isn't really a big deal. Maybe you have an advanced degree in mathematics. Good for you. But maybe there's something else that you or someone that you know, something else that you're struggling with or someone that you know is struggling with, that they're avoiding. And I want to suggest that embracing the confusion in this case is actually maybe the fastest way through. Now, to try and tie this back into blockchain, if I ask you how many conversations you've had throughout your academic and professional career where someone, another student or another teacher, or maybe an article or a book or a YouTube video or whatever, helped unlock some confusion for you, how many times has that happened? And how impossible is it for you to give credit to that other student, that other teacher, that other YouTube channel, whatever it might be? And so what's interesting for me about this technology is that blockchain, for the first time in human history, introduces this shared sense of time. A clock that pays people to keep it ticking, a clock that ticks in blocks, and into these blocks we can put anything we want. And so I wonder what would happen if we could arrange our school systems and our tutoring sessions and our teacher training sessions to encourage people to keep track of these moments of confusion and the relief of this confusion without necessarily worrying about the sorting hat and the GPAs and some of these other kind of summative details that we're focused on right now, and instead focus on the experience and keeping track of that experience. So if that's interesting for you, it's interesting for me. And that's where I think this is going. I'd love to talk to you about it afterwards. Any questions?
So is confusion heavily linked to shame?
Is confusion heavily linked to shame? I think it all depends on the narrative that you have, the story that you have. I think all of us here can relate that when you talk about school, most of it is a cat and mouse game where you're trying to trick your friends and the teacher, maybe your parents, your siblings, into believing that you're not confused, that everything's under control because you belong somehow and that you don't want to be kind of, excommunicated. You don't want to be, removed from that group. So big time linked to shame. Not just shame in a recoverable sense, but shame in an existential sense. Do I belong? Maybe I'm not keeping up fast enough. Maybe I'm not getting it quickly enough. It's absolutely terrifying if you think about it in those terms. And I think that a lot of us have internalized that because of these experiences that we've had growing up. Yes, very much linked to shame.
So how did you develop your ability to making something very completely, extremely complex into some very easily understand way to people.
How did I develop that skill to make complex easy to understand? I can tell you my trick as a teacher is actually quite simple. I see teachers as an obstacle to learning, fundamentally. Because if I had the skill, I could flash into your mind what I already know, and then we could have a conversation as two experts in this particular domain or whatever. But instead, I have to, flap my mouth and, breathe at you so that your ears pick it up and, try and get my pictures into your head somehow. It's all very noisy and slow and inefficient. So it's much faster, I found, as a teacher, just to figure out as quickly as I possibly can how you see the world as a student. Everything about how you see it. What do you know? What are you good at? What do you struggle with? What does this problem mean to you? And once I get a sense of where you are, then I can sit next to you and talk about what I see over there. That seems to do the trick most of the time.
I think you are the most sophisticated therapist I have ever seen.
Oh, thanks. That's a great compliment. Yes, thank you. Any other questions?
Rashmi Rao, Stratic Limited.
Nice.
Sherif, thank you so much for sharing your experiential anecdotes to bring the session to life. I was curious about the ability to extend what you've just shared outside of the formal education structure, because there's so much about lifelong learning. And especially in an area like technology, I don't think any of us can ever call ourselves a technology expert. All we can strive to be is a student of technology, which moves at such pace. So curious about how the technology that we are talking about, the NEAR, has been applied, or the possibilities and use cases for lifelong learning.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get close to that question. The question of how does NEAR and what we're working on in education at NEAR relate to lifelong learning. So on a personal level, and some of my team, I've convinced them to believe with me that essentially all education is some arbitrarily curated sequence of content. The textbook you're reading, the lecture you're reading, because you're living in sort of time passing, you can only sort of hear one idea or read one chapter at a time. We're limited by that experience. The sequence, the order of these things is arbitrary. And what you include or exclude, the curation, is also arbitrary. And so what I think is interesting about this question of lifelong learning is that we could conceive of a system that incentivizes people to help curate and sequence content for their preference. And in that way, participate in an economy of learning throughout their life. So maybe just to kind of add a little bit more color to that, I can imagine a system where I decide I'm going to spend, let's say, a month learning about whatever, the Rust programming language, let's say. And I have some background in other programming languages. And so I might say, who else has my background that has this amount of time to learn this topic? And you can imagine over some months or years of using a system like this, there would be an answer to that question. These 200,000 people actually have a similar experience to your background and had a month to study this particular target. And those 200,000 people had this to say about the curation, about the sequence, about the questions they had, about the answers they had. And in that way, I might benefit from all of those people. The money that I would spend, let's say, to make my learning more efficient, could accrue to those people that spent time curating and sequencing this content maybe last month or last year. And in that economy, every time that I spend, let's say, every minute I spend correcting an article, adding a new explanation, recording, my own solution, is something of an investment that I'm making in the system that would pay me back over the life of that lesson. Something like that would be interesting, I think. Any other questions? We may have a grant for that system if anybody's interested in building it, by the way. Any other questions? Okay, if not, thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it. Yeah.